Here is the one simple phrase that has the power to dramatically and positively affect your leadership ability. But first, story. That's it. I know, it's simple. Maybe you've even uttered a version of this yourself, like, but first, coffee, before you can effectively face the morning chaos of getting kids out the door, or before sitting down for an important meeting, you need coffee first. The idea that before you do anything well, you need something else first. And when it comes to great leadership, what you need first is a story. Now, as you'll read in the book, The Story Edge, there's a couple of different dimensions to this, to the but first story concept. The first is the most obvious. It's the stories you tell. If you're going to make a presentation more compelling, first, you're gonna need the right story. Oh, one of my favorite stories in the book is about an email I received where the subject line read, the $1.2 million story, and you guessed it, one well-told story at the beginning of a 20-minute presentation that included the Q&A got the leader $1.2 million. I digress. If you're trying to inspire creative problem solving, tell the stories. There's another story in the book about a chocolate company that unexpectedly unlocked a whole new level of creativity in their flavors by telling stories. And trust me, you won't be able to resist ordering a few chocolate bars for yourself. If you mess up, tell a story. Yes, another great story about, I keep getting distracted, but I'm thinking about so there's another great story about a leader, the leader of an olive oil company that when I wrote the book, I'd never heard of before, and now it seems like everyone is using this olive oil. You get the idea. But first, story can definitely mean, but first, tell the story. And if you did that and nothing else, you'd see a difference in the way others respond to you as their leader. However, that is only part of the power of this phrase. There are two other dimensions of but first story. One I'll tell you now, one you'll have to read about in the book to find out, and that one is actually my favorite. The second dimension is when it comes to great leadership, before you do anything, you need to know what the story is. Not the story you tell, but rather the story you need to understand, because here's the thing. Behind every problem, there's a story that you don't know yet. There's a story that explains what's really going on and why. If something doesn't quite make sense, if a team member is suddenly acting out of character or a client suddenly pulls out of a deal, something is happening. And though the demands of modern business insist that leaders act and react instantly using only their gut as their guide, this is where I'm telling you to do the opposite. It may be the most controversial stance I've ever taken that, yeah, leaders will be better if they seek out, and heaven forbid, consider, but first, the story, the part that might not be so obvious. But first, story means taking a risk, acknowledging that there might be more worth knowing, and taking a moment to uncover that story versus jumping immediately into action based on the initial, oftentimes limited and frequently biased information you've been given. Maybe you've heard that leaders need to be curious. I was just at a conference where a panel of leaders were talking about being great leaders, and they kept saying, stay curious, be curious, but they never said how. This is how. But first, story. The story behind the action, the story behind the problem, the story behind the person. Oh, same conference, talking about being curious. They were also talking about belonging. Important, right? Belonging. Leaders need to encourage and enable belonging. Yes, I agree again and again, but how? Well, if belonging in the workplace means feeling valued through positive connections with others and able to bring your authentic self to work, then taking a moment to know your people's stories seems like the most natural human way to make belonging possible. But first, story. This phrase is just the beginning of what I call story-forward leadership, an approach that will transform the way you lead and requires very little work on your part. It's more a shift in your mentality, to put some space between you and the direction we're currently going with virtual this and automation that, and instead shift to the human side, to the story side. Story-forward leaders are what the world needs right now and doesn't even know it. You're the first to know that the phrase to live by is, but first, story.